In the latest chapter of One Piece, we got our first real look at the mighty kingdom of Elbaf, almost an entire 25 years since the first time it was mentioned in the story. And Oda also finally gave us a glimpse of the infamous Prince Loki, or as he prefers to be called, the Sun God. Sound familiar? And just as we saw with Kaido and Big Mom, Loki doesn't look a thing like his original silhouette, but it may end up being for the best because his reveal came in one of the rawest panels that we've had in quite some time. It also shares a lot of striking similarities to when we first saw Oars in the freezer during Thriller Bark, who is an ancient giant, which I'll touch on again shortly. But we also learned that in the pursuit of a mysterious legendary devil fruit, Loki even killed his own father, King Harald, who is likely named after Harald Hardrada, who was the king of Norway, as his death is what signaled the end of the Viking Age, which parallels well to One Piece since King Harald's son Loki wants to bring about the end of the world. And if you saw my Elbaf video from just over a year ago, then you may have already expected this would be the case because that is essentially what Loki wanted in Norse mythology. After engineering the death of the beloved god Baldur, Loki got tied up and had venom dripping onto his eyes, potentially explaining why Loki in One Piece has his eyes bandaged up. And it was said that Loki doesn't break free until the end of the world comes, which they call Ragnarok. So clearly Oda has decided to play off of that in a major way here during this arc, which then brings a few very important things into question. What was the legendary devil fruit that he was after? Is this guy going to end up being a friend or a foe? And why exactly does he want to bring about the end of the world? And maybe we should also ask why Lola turned this guy down at their wedding after she tried to marry almost everyone else that she met. Now, as for his devil fruit, I do think that's something that'll get revealed relatively soon from the time I'm recording this, because Oda usually doesn't waste that much time revealing devil fruits within an arc. So I'm going to save my theories on that for the very end, just for the sake of the longevity of this video, I guess, and I'll probably do another more thorough one later on after it's revealed, so maybe subscribe for that. But instead, I want to start by bringing up another very important thing we just learned, which I think will have major ramifications during this arc, which is that Loki is actually not the only prince, because so is Harudin. This puts all new context into Harudin's line about wanting to become the king of the giants during the Colosseum in Dressrosa. But the thing is, I don't know if that necessarily means that they have the same parents, because if you go back to the Big Mom flashback, we actually see them mention the birth of Loki in the castle, and even right away they call him Prince Loki. But Harudin is literally right there, and nobody calls him Prince Harudin. Nor does anyone bother to mention that it was his brother that was just born. Plus, shouldn't he be in that castle that they just talked about? We also saw that Harudin wanted to come to Egghead to get the crew, but the new giant warrior pirates had seniority, so they got to go instead. You would think that a normal prince would get to make that call, right? So I think what Oda might be doing here with Loki and Harudin is setting up a parallel to Loki and Odin from Norse mythology, because there Loki and Odin were called blood brothers, but not because they had the same parents. It's because they did some kind of blood sharing ritual, which there are a few different ideas on how that may have happened, but regardless, it may just set up the situation that Harudin is adopted. And there's actually a little bit of evidence that Harudin will be the Odin parallel here, because when he beat Mach Weiss in Dressrosa, he used an attack called Gungnir, which is the name of Odin's spear, so there you go. And Odin and Loki were also known companions of Thor, meaning that we should probably see a Thor-like figure during this arc, who I think is probably going to end up being an El. I mean, he's already got lightning powers and used attacks with Thor in the name, plus with all the Skypiea connections, he should definitely be reappearing during this arc at some point. Check out this video if you want to hear more about that. But the reason that I like this whole idea going on with Harudin and Loki is because it kind of turns them into another pair, which we have seen with the other important giants, such as Yorl and Jarl and Dorian Brogi. Those were past sets of co-captains for the giant warrior pirates, and Harudin is the captain of the new giant warrior pirates, so maybe Loki's gonna become co-captain of that group with Harudin. Or maybe they become co-kings of Elbaf, kinda like Neko and Inu were for Zoe. But I think we still need to ask how Harudin became a prince if he isn't actually the biological son of Harald. And I think there's sort of two options here. One might be that he was really good friends with Loki going back to their childhood, so maybe they decided to become brothers, somewhat like Ace, Sabo, and Luffy did, meaning that Harudin kinda became a prince by extension. Or maybe after Harald's death, Harudin was sort of picked by the other giants as the next heir to the throne, since Loki was not acceptable by most of the population. I mean, we saw Harudin training to be a warrior from a young age, and he looked up to Yorl and Jarl as the most respected warriors of all giant kind, so he does seem to exude a lot of the values that they care about. Plus, the fact fact that he teamed up with Luffy shows that he's a good judge of character, meaning he might honestly be a good fit for the king. But you know, since King Harold is dead right now, then we need to ask why they're both still princes. Well, I think it's because each of them lack in a very important area, where Harudin has the right temperament, of course, but he just isn't strong enough to be the king of Elbaf and to maybe earn all of their respect and protect the island or whatever. But then for Loki, he's probably plenty strong enough. He's probably the strongest giant on the island, honestly, but obviously he has ulterior motives, and that might give more of a reason why they both need to become like co-kings, because they can kind of cover each other's weaknesses. Because I mean, if you're out there getting one-shotted by Gear 2 Luffy in the post-time skip, that's just not a good look, especially if you're a freaking giant. So I think right now Jarl's probably just maintaining the position, since Goldberg said that he would report to him, which makes it seem like he's an authoritative figure right now, at least until one of these princes get their act together. And I think that's probably why Harudin went and sought out the Maramara no Mi. He even asked if you've ever seen a giant with a Logia power before, which might hint that Loki actually has one as well. And right after he said that is when he said he'd become king of the giants, so maybe what he was hoping for is that the Maramara no Mi would make him then strong enough to earn the title of king, since he was too weak as it stands now. And so I think mainly this situation with Harudin and Loki is going to continue to be a very, very pertinent thing throughout the arc. And I honestly love it because it sets up yet another good brother, bad brother type situation, which we have seen several times before in the story. Maybe most notably with Doflamingo and Corazon. In fact, there's quite a few parallels here between Loki and Doflamingo already. They both have been shown with their tongues sticking out, they both don't show their eyes, they both killed their own father, and you could say they both have like fallen from grace in some way, with Dofi coming down from Marijois and Loki seemingly being cast out of Elbaf. Now this may mean that Loki is going to be as evil as Doflamingo, or maybe he's got more legit reasons for doing the things he wants to accomplish. And we've also seen this good brother bad brother thing with Sabo and Stelly, who were also adopted brothers. Sabo wanted nothing to do with the noble's lifestyle, while Stelly wants to sit on the freaking empty throne. We've also kind of seen it with Sanji, where he was the only one who didn't end up becoming basically a mindless killing machine among all his siblings. And speaking of Sanji, maybe we should talk a little bit about Loki's wedding, because just like Sanji, Loki is sort of the outcast of his family, but yet he still is technically a prince, potentially being the reason why he was the one chosen to go through with the wedding. But the key difference here, I think, is that I don't see Loki being strong-armed into a wedding like Sanji was, where they threatened Zeph and the Straw Hats, because I mean, if it took all of the warriors of Elbaf to corral Loki, then he's obviously just a beast. So I'm starting to wonder if Loki might have actually been the one who set up the wedding in the first place, which kind of makes sense because, for starters, the giants don't like Big Mom at all. The fact that the wedding almost happened in the first place is kind of weird in retrospect. But we were also told that Loki fell in love with Lola at first sight, and thus sought her hand in marriage. So I think the whole situation might be kind of an inversion of Sanji's, where Loki instead forced Elbaf to go through with it all, instead of Elbaf forcing him, where they probably didn't want to, but with him being the prince, they sorta had to. And I mean, if Loki wants to destroy the whole world, what better way to do that than team up with Big Mom, who probably would have done the same thing? But I think the million-dollar question here is, why did Lola turn him down? She was ready to marry freaking Absalom, who is an absolute freak, so if she has any standards, they're pretty dang low. I mean, her epithet is literally marriage proposal Lola. But if Loki was gonna use the alliance with Big Mom to also help him take over the world, then I wonder if Lola kind of felt that Loki wasn't there for her specifically. Like, even though we know he was actually in love with her, perhaps she viewed it all as if she was being used in their game, so she backed off. But let's get back to discussing Loki's future role within this arc, because right now he's obviously giving off some evil bad guy energy, and we still don't really know who our big villain is going to be in this arc, so Loki might just fit the bill. But I think that's a tough call until we learn more about why he is the way he is. Because I think like 99 out of 100 times you hear something like that, it's a no-brainer that he's going to be a bad guy. But the thing for me is that we already know the final war is coming in One Piece. We know that an event will be necessary to change the world for the better, so we can take down the world government and celestial dragons and all of that. Ragnarok is basically an inevitability. So depending on what lore Loki is aware of, it may honestly not be the worst thing for him to be pursuing it. And even if you go look at the lore behind what happens after Ragnarok in Norse mythology, usually a new world emerges. It's almost like a cycle of rebirth in a way. We also know that Fishman Island is meant to be destroyed by Luffy at some point, thanks to Shiarly's prophecy. Now, yes, I've heard the theories that it could be a fake Luffy who does it, like Katarina Devon, but if we take it at face value, it'll be Luffy. But obviously he's gonna have a good reason to do that, right? And we already know the fishmen are gonna move to the surface eventually, and that Poseidon's supposed to help with that by using the Noah, so the prophecy we saw may not be the worst thing. And the most common theory for that, I think, is that it's all because Luffy's destroying the red line, which is right above it, which would probably be a good thing because he's beating the celestial dragons. And it would make Laboon happy, which is maybe the most important thing. So I think that if Loki knows something similar needs to happen in Elbaf, or that it simply is going to happen and that maybe good things will come after that, he may not necessarily be in the wrong. You could kind of even make that same comparison as Wano, because at some point their borders are going to be knocked down, probably by Zunisha, which will unleash Pluton. So it's like Fishman Island and Wano are already meant to go through these cataclysmic events that involve reintroducing ancient weapons to the rest of the world. And this all ties to something that I've mentioned a few times in my other videos, but I think Fishman Island, Wano, and Elbaf make up what I call the Big Three, which are like the three major story arcs that were foreshadowed years and years in advance as places we were definitely gonna go to at some point. No islands had quite the hype as these three, except probably Laugh-Tale. And Fishman Island gave us Poseidon, Wano had Pluton, and Elbaf is likely the perfect place for Uranus with all the Skypiea connections that this arc is likely to have. So the question then is, what major event could happen at Elbaf that would free Uranus, which can parallel the other arcs? Well, that's why the thumbnail is what it is, and why it was something similar in my first Elbaf video. If Yggdrasil were to fall, it would not only bring terror to that entire island, especially those living at the top of it, but since Uranus is the god of the sky, it might make sense for it to be residing somewhere near the top, and so at least symbolically speaking, maybe the tree has to come down to bring Uranus down in a very similar way to how Fishman Island has to get destroyed to bring Poseidon up. And if that's Loki's goal, then it might explain why he's always been kind of an outcast. Even earlier in the arc, we saw people say the country would be done for if that tree fell, which ties to Norse mythology because it was said that around Yggdrasil exists all else, including the 9 worlds, and that during the events of Ragnarok, the tree will shake and tremble, and if it were to ever fall, then the world of the gods would die with it. And this might be the exact reason why Loki wants to do it. We've already seen there be various gods in Elbaf, including another sun god, and Loki might want to be the only one. Or he might know that there's a specific one who's going to be like a savior, and he just believes that it's himself, which would go a long way to explaining why he went as far as to kill his own dad in order to get that devil fruit. And it was also said that the fruit was passed down through the royal family, and while we haven't seen a royal family do that with devil fruits before, we have seen them do that with important information. Most recently, we saw that with Lily's letter in the Nefertari family, but we also saw something similar with the royalty of Fishman Island or Wano, who passed down information about their ancient weapons. So I'm wondering if this devil fruit in Elbaf might have something to do with the legend of Uranus. Perhaps eating it is what lets you become the weapon, or lets you control the weapon, or power the weapon, or some mix of those things. I do have some ideas for that, but just let me save that discussion for the end of the video because I first want to cover a couple of other things, like whether Loki is going to team up with us or not. I would say it's probably not going to happen originally, and in fact, I think a really good match for him would be Eustace Kid. And now I know a lot of people think that Kid is dead, but like, this is Oda we're talking about. If Kinemon's alive, Kid's alive. And I think at this point, after what Shanks did to him, Kid probably wouldn't mind laying waste to Elbaf, or the whole world even, which might align him with Loki's goals. I also wouldn't be shocked if Loki disliked Shanks, or maybe Shanks even had a hand in tying Loki up, so they could be aligned there as well. It would also set up a paradigm where Loki and Kid are on one side, with Luffy and Harudin on the other. Now, I do still think that Loki's going to end up being a good guy by the very end, probably teaming up with Harudin like I mentioned earlier, but the route there may require some temporary allegiances. And speaking of allegiances, I also want to spend some time talking about Gecko Moria, who I believe will definitely be involved in this arc by virtue of joining Cross Guild, since, you know, he's an ex-warlord like most of their top brass. And as I've mentioned in some other videos, the reason Cross Guild probably is going to get involved is because they need the Straw Hats' poneglyph rubbings, especially after Kid and Law both already lost. But now, as for Moria specifically, the first reason I think he has to be there is because his biggest attack in Thriller Bark was called Shadow's Asgard, which ties to Norse mythology because Asgard is the land of the gods. But the bigger reason is because of what I said at the beginning of the video about how Loki's introduction is very similar to the one we had for Oars. They even have the chains, the very cold area, the horns, the whole thing. So what I'm thinking is that this arc almost has to be where we learn more about the ancient giants, and maybe Loki could even potentially be one, or at least part of one, because we know that Oars from Thriller Bark died 500 years ago, and Oars Jr. was only 72 years old, so we do kind of have an awkwardness about where these guys come from, or if there's more out there, or whatever. forever. Also, Ors Jr. had Ors III on his flag, which hints there may be one either in between the Thriller Bark Ors, or maybe there's one even before the Thriller Bark Ors, which I think is very likely. And in chapter 1130, we do see this massive sword off to the right of the island, which would be even too massive for a giant to wield. It also kind of reminds me of the one we saw outside Onigashima, which of course was a giant skull with horns that again makes me wonder if all of this is somehow connected. Like, is the royalty of Elbaf all ancient giants because they're the strongest or something? And going back to that sword, you know, we were also told that Ors was the continent puller, and at least personally, I don't think the one in Thriller Bark was quite big enough to do that. I mean, he was huge, but not like continent huge. But if there's a giant who can wield that sword from chapter 1130, they would probably be big enough. And so I think we're definitely on the path to get some Ors lore here during Elbaf. But alright, let's go ahead and get into that devil fruit discussion now. And one really important thing to note here is that in the officials for chapter 1130, they did clarify that Loki already ate the fruit. So that means we can get rid of theories like the Maramara no Mi, which Harudin went after in Dressrosa, or the Nika fruit theories and all of that stuff. It basically has to be a fruit that we haven't heard of before. And in addition to that, since it was passed down through the royal family, that almost guarantees that it's going to be something Ancient Kingdom related. Like, it's one of the most important fruits and they left it here for some kind of protection. And you have to wonder why it's that fruit they're protecting and not Luffy's, which kind of seems to be the most important one in the verse. So since we're basically taking stabs in the dark here for new devil fruits, I think the best way to tackle this whole thing is just by giving an answer for each type of fruit. So I'm going to start with zones, and personally, I really hope it's not one of these, because we just have mythical zones everywhere at this point, it feels like. It's like the Oprah meme, but with zone fruits. And it's starting to feel kind of like if you don't have a mythical zone, then you're sort of a scrub. Sort of how it felt like early on in the story with Logia fruits before people were using hockey. But if I did have to pick a zone fruit, I think I would either go with like a true sun god zone fruit, and what I mean by that is one that actually gives him sun-related powers, since Luffy doesn't really have those, or a Fenrir fruit, which is probably the most popular theory that I've heard so far. And now Fenrir does make a lot of sense because, you know, he's a wolf and Loki is chained up in an area with lots of giant wolves around him, and in Norse mythology, Fenrir is actually the son of Loki. Fenrir also gets tied up with magical chains, and if Loki is tied up with sea stone chains to control his Fenrir powers, then that's a pretty nice way to weave it all together too. And typically speaking, Fenrir is shown being around fire or using fire powers, so this would likely be like a mythical Inu Inu no Mi model Fenrir, which would come with some fire-esque abilities. Almost being like an inversion to Yamato's fruit, which was another mythical dog fruit, but instead Yamato had ice powers. And her fruit was actually said to be the guardian deity of Wano, so I'm wondering if Loki's fruit might be kind of the same thing, but for Elbaf. Or maybe it's kind of the opposite thing, but for Elbaf, since he wants to like destroy the whole world. And then as for Paramecia fruits, I could see like a sun fruit, or maybe a weather control fruit, or maybe some sort of hypnosis fruit. And so I say the sun for kind of the same reason as the sun god fruit, which is that it would give him actual sun powers, which would be sort of a nice contrast to Luffy's sun god powers, which are basically just rubber. And I think this could potentially be a Loki as well, but I wanted to mention it here because like a sun isn't an element, so I wasn't sure where this would go. But I think this kind of fruit would be a really good tie to the Mother Flame, which is basically a fusion reactor, which is basically what the sun is, because Lilith even said that if they had better resources, then they could even make their own sun. And so if Loki actually does have these kind of powers, then he might be able to make like Leloucia lasers at will or something, which would definitely make him capable of destroying the world. And if he teamed up with Kid, who has this giant railgun thing, who knows what they could do. And now as for the weather control Paramecia, I really like this idea because it could effectively turn Loki into Uranus. Now, we don't know literally anything about Uranus yet other than the name, so I'm sort of speculating here. And I know that a lot of people currently believe that it's what was over Leloucia, but as I've covered in depth before, I'm not so convinced yet. And before that event happened, I think the most commonly accepted theory for Uranus was that it was going to control the weather, and I think I'm going to stand by that. And so if it does tie to this devil fruit, maybe it almost makes Loki into an improved aircon like the one we saw at Egghead. But then as for a hypnosis type fruit, the reason that I even mention this is because, for one thing, Loki in Norse mythology was known as a trickster, and he could actually even shapeshift. But tying it back to Uranus, if that ends up being another living creature of some kind, then it might help to have a way to control it, and that might be what this devil fruit does. We've kind of seen this before with Momo and Shirahoshi, but it's just that theirs were passed down by blood. And also, you know, Elbaf had a lot of illusions or trickery very early on in the arc, and Loki's eyes are bandaged right now, which might be a hint that they have some kind of power. And I know this might sound weird at first, but But there are also some weird connections between him and Django, or at least their designs. They have similar facial hair, they both have their eyes covered, they both even have a similar style of hat, but maybe instead of doing Django's type of hypnosis, which the powers were given to him because of a random mushroom that he ate that grew on his chin, it's instead a type of hypnosis that ties to Miss Golden Week's paint, which is not from a devil fruit power, and all we really know is that it's a type of hypnosis, and we don't yet know even where this paint comes from. But the main reason that I bring it up is that in Miss Golden Week's cover story, we actually see her use the paint to befriend and control a pterodactyl so that it flies her places, which sorta gives me some Uranus vibes already, especially since she got that pterodactyl from Little Garden, where we first met Dorian Broggie. And there's actually a lot more evidence here for that, but I don't want to dive into this one too much because my next video actually covers this in great detail, specifically in regards to Usopp's potential upgrade this arc, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that one. But lastly, let's get into the Logia options, and this is what I'm really hoping for, and what I really want is for this fruit to be our first special Logia, because we've seen various types of zone fruits before. We saw Katakuri had a special Paramecia, which was a new type, but we have not had a new branch of Logia just yet. And you know, building off of all that Uranus stuff, what if he got almost like a Logia? I'm still working on the name there, but it would almost make him like the Avatar or something. And if he was able to control all the different elements, then he should effectively be able to control the weather. Something like that would be as close to a true god fruit as there could possibly be, I think. Now, I could also see the Sun fruit working here for similar reasons that I stated earlier, but also because if it was a Logia, then it might be like an improved version of Kizaru's fruit, because we've already seen the opposite thing happen for Kuzan and Akainu with Monet and Ace's fruits respectively, but we still need one on either side for Kizaru, so maybe someone's going to one-up his instead of the other way around. And again, that would really make him a true sun god, right? But I think the biggest reason why I'm really hoping that it's going to be a Logia is that we absolutely need to see a Logia awakening. And I think if there was one arc to do it, this is going to be the one. If Enel comes back, if Crossguild shows up with Crocodile, if Loki has a Logia, it just sets the stage all too perfectly for us to see Logia awakenings galore, and that's something I want to see. Especially if they change environments permanently, because that might lead to the destruction of Elbaf that I was talking about earlier. But alright guys, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a big like and also consider subscribing. We're going to be making a few videos a month all the way till we get to Laugh Tale, and I'd love to have you around for the ride. But until next time, later.